Paris, 1789. The streets taste of rage and hunger. Bread costs more than a day's wages. Children cry with hollow stomachs. And 20 kilometers southwest, beyond the muddy roads and starving villages, a palace glitters. Versailles. 700 rooms, 67 staircases, 253 windows, 1 in 250 fireplaces, gold leaf covering every surface the eye can see, fountains that drain rivers, gardens that swallow forests. A building so vast, it required its own city to sustain it. This is the dark story of the palace that ate a kingdom from the inside out. For most people, Versailles is a fairy tale. Magnificent halls. The Hall of Mirrors, where light dances across 357 mirrors and catches on crystal chandeliers. Gardens so perfect they seem carved from dreams. The ultimate symbol of French glory and elegance. But behind the gold, there were bodies. Workers who fell from scaffolding and were buried in unmarked graves. Servants who slept forward to a room smaller than a closet. An entire kingdom bled dry to maintain one man's fantasy of absolute power. Here, 5 men died every week during construction, and no one bothered to record their names. Here, the king spent half of France's annual revenue, while peasants starved in fields visible from the palace windows. Here, decisions were made at masked balls that would send millions to early graves. How did one building become so expensive? It helped destroy a 1,000-year-old monarchy. What price had to be paid for all this beauty? And by whom? Who built it? Who cleaned it? Who died for it? And most importantly, when the revolution came and the mob marched through those gilded halls with blood on their hands, had any of it been worth it? If you enjoy deep investigations into the architecture of power and the families who wielded it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which palace to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. Part 1. The Hunting Lodge that became an obsession, November 1623. A small hunting lodge stands in a swamp. This is where it starts. Not with Louis XIV, the Sun King who would transform Versailles into the symbol of absolute monarchy, but with his father, Louis XIII, a man who loved hunting more than governing and solitude more than his own court. The village of Versailles was nothing. A collection of perhaps 500 souls, peasant farmers working thin soil, a few craftsmen, a priest serving a modest church. The land was poor. Too much water in the low areas, not enough in the high. The roads were mud half the year and frozen ruts the other half. There was no reason for anyone important to visit, except the hunting. The forests around Versailles were thick with game. Deer, wild boar, pheasants, rabbits. For a king who found court life stifling and preferred the company of dogs to courtiers, this swampy corner of the Ile-de-France was paradise. Louis XIII came here to escape, to ride hard, to shoot, to sleep in simple rooms far from the scheming nobles of Paris. In 1623, he commissioned a small lodge, brick and stone, modest, perhaps 24 rooms, just enough space for the king and his hunting companions to rest between expeditions. The building cost was unremarkable. A few thousand livres, less than what the crown spent on a week of court entertainments in Paris. The lodge worked. Louis XIV returned again and again, sometimes staying for weeks. He expanded it slightly in 1631, adding 2 wings. Still simple, still small, still a hunting retreat, nothing more. He died in 1643. His son, Louis XIV, was 4 years old. The boy who would become the Sun King grew up in Paris, in the Louvre, surrounded by danger his father had never faced. When Louis XIV was 10 years old, France exploded into civil war. The Fronde, a revolt of nobles and parlements against royal authority, against centralized power, against the very idea that a king could rule without their consent. For 5 years, the boy king and his mother, Anne of Austria, fled Paris multiple times. They slept in drafty provincial chateaux while Paris burned. They watched as nobles who should have been loyal plotted to kidnap or kill them. They learned that Paris was not safe, that courtiers could not be trusted, that power without control was an illusion. The Fronde ended in 1653. The monarchy survived, but Louis XIV, now 15, had learned lessons that would shape everything he would build. First lesson: never let nobles gather power in their own territories. Keep them close, keep them dependent, keep them competing for favor instead of plotting rebellion. Second lesson: Paris is dangerous. The mob is too close. The parlements are too bold. The capital is where kings can be controlled, challenged, even murdered. Third lesson: a king must appear untouchable, not merely powerful, but divinely ordained. So far above ordinary humanity that even the greatest nobles feel small in his presence. These lessons would find their expression in a building, not in Paris, in a swamp 20 kilometers to the southwest. At his father's forgotten hunting lodge, Louis XIV took personal control of government in 1661, after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, the minister who had effectively ruled during his minority. He was 23 years old. France was the most populous kingdom in Europe, with perhaps 20 million people. The treasury was in chaos. The nobility was restless. And Louis had a plan. He would build something so magnificent, so overwhelming, so expensive, that it would become the center of everything. A palace that forced every important noble in France to abandon their own estates and live under his roof, competing for his attention like dogs begging for scraps. A machine designed to turn aristocrats into servants and resistance into submission. He would build it at Versailles. The decision seemed insane to almost everyone who heard it. The royal architect, Louis XIV, tried to convince the king to choose a better location. Flat land near Paris, access to water, solid ground for foundations. The swamp at Versailles had none of these advantages. The finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, pleaded with Louis to save money, to invest in fortifications or ships or anything more useful than a pleasure palace in the middle of nowhere. "Sire," he wrote, "Versailles is the most wretched of all places." Louis ignored them all. He had his reasons. Versailles was far enough from Paris to be defensible. A mob could not easily march 20 kilometers through countryside to attack the king. The location could be controlled, access restricted, and psychologically forcing courtiers to leave Paris and come to him, to his chosen ground, was itself an assertion of power. Also, the swamp didn't matter, because Louis XIV was about to spend enough money to turn a swamp into a garden that would make the gods jealous. If the land wouldn't cooperate, he would simply remake the land. Construction began in earnest in 61. At first, it was modest. Improvements to his father's lodge, better interiors, expanded guest rooms. Louis XIV added 2 large wings, creating a proper chateau that could host court festivities. But Louis XIV wasn't building a chateau. He was building a statement. And statements, he understood, had to be overwhelming. In 1668, he threw a party, the Grand Divertissement Royal de Versailles. 5 days of festivities, theater performances, ballets, fireworks, feasts. The entire court invited. 600 nobles descending on the still unfinished palace to witness what their king was creating. The message was clear. This is mine. This is what I can do. And you have never seen anything like it. The party cost more than 100,000 livres, enough to feed a town of 5,000 people for a year. And it was just the beginning. In 1678, Louis made the decision that would define the rest of his reign and drain France for decades. He would expand Versailles beyond anything Europe had ever seen. It would not be a chateau. It would be a city, the seat of government, the home of the entire royal court. Thousands of nobles and their servants living in a single complex, their lives centered completely around the king. Jules Hardouin-Mansart, the new royal architect, was given a simple instruction: make it spectacular. Cost is no object. Hardouin-Mansart drew up plans that made even Laveau's expansions look modest. 2 enormous wings stretching from the original chateau, each longer than a city block. A chapel as grand as most cathedrals. The Hall of Mirrors, a gallery 73 meters long, 10.5 meters wide, 12.3 meters high, designed to showcase French craftsmanship and blind visitors with reflected light. The gardens would be tripled in size. More fountains, more sculptures, more carefully trimmed hedges, and geometrically perfect flower beds than any king had ever commanded. And it all had to be finished as quickly as possible. Because in 1682, Louis intended to move the entire court from Paris to Versailles permanently. 4 years. That was the deadline. In 1678, construction at Versailles stopped being a building project and became something closer to a military campaign, or a war fought against mud and stone and gravity itself. The workforce exploded. By 1681, more than 36,000 workers were on site at peak periods. Stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, painters, glaziers, metalworkers. Entire trades guilds were emptied. Men were conscripted from across France, sometimes against their will, to come dig foundations and haul stone for the king's dream. 3 hospitals had to be built on site just to handle the injuries. The numbers behind that fact are worth sitting with. 3 hospitals for construction injuries. Because the work was so dangerous, the pace so brutal, the conditions so terrible that medical facilities designed to treat hundreds of patients at once became necessary infrastructure. 5 or more men died every week, not every month, every week, falling from scaffolding, crushed under stone blocks, succumbing to exhaustion and disease, buried in mass graves that were never marked because their names were never recorded. We know they existed because the hospitals existed, because the death rate was mentioned, almost casually, in letters between ministers discussing construction schedules. But we don't know who they were. Sons, fathers, brothers, erased from history, except as a statistic, 5 per week. The working day began before dawn and ended after dusk. 12 hours minimum, 14 or 16 during summer, when daylight lasted longer and the king wanted faster progress. The men earned about 5 sous per day. Enough, barely, for a small piece of butter. Not enough to support a family. Safety did not exist. Scaffolding was erected as fast as possible, often poorly secured. Workers climbed ladders made from whatever wood was available, sometimes rotten, sometimes too weak for the weight they had to bear. When scaffold collapsed, when ladders broke, when men fell 3 or 4 stories onto stone courtyards, work continued around their bodies while others carried them to the hospitals. Disease spread through the cramped workers' barracks. Dysentery, typhus, fevers that had no name. Undernourishment made everything worse. The men were fed but barely. Thin soup, coarse bread, just enough to keep them working, not enough to keep them healthy. Records show that the first cause of death at Versailles among the workforce was undernourishment and disease. Not accidents, not falls, starvation and sickness. They were building a palace of unimaginable luxury while their own bodies wasted away. Prison was the punishment for those who protested. When workers went on strike in 1681, demanding better conditions and higher pay, Louis XIV had the ringleaders arrested and imprisoned without trial. When family members complained after losing loved ones to the worksite, they were also imprisoned, publicly as a warning. The message was clear: this palace will be built. Your suffering is irrelevant. Your deaths are acceptable. Continue working or go to prison. Those are your choices. One incident survives in correspondence from 1682. Louis XIV came to inspect the construction progress. He walked through the work site, surrounded by courtiers in silk and lace, stepping carefully around piles of stone and lumber. A woman broke through the crowds, screaming, cursing. She was the mother of a worker who had died when scaffolding collapsed. She wanted the king to know, to care, to acknowledge that her son had been a person, not just another pair of hands. Louis XIV was shocked, not by her grief, but by the audacity of being confronted, of being reminded that the men building his palace were human, that they had families, that they suffered and died. Guards seized her. She was dragged away and thrown into prison for the crime of making the king far uncomfortable. Louis never mentioned the incident again. Construction continued without pause. The scale of the logistics was staggering. Stone had to be quarried and transported from across France. Marble from the Pyrenees, timber from forests hundreds of kilometers away. Iron and lead for pipes and roofing. Glass for thousands of windows. A special canal was dug to transport materials by barge. Roads were built or widened to handle the constant traffic of wagons carrying supplies to the site. At the peak of construction, hundreds of horse-drawn carts arrived daily. The sound of wheels on stone, hammers on nails, saws cutting timber, and men shouting orders created a noise so constant that courtiers complained they couldn't sleep, even in the parts of the palace that were already finished. Because that was the other absurdity. The court moved to Versailles in 1682, as Louis had commanded. But the palace was nowhere near complete. Nobles arrived to find construction sites where their apartments should be. Dust in every room, scaffolding blocking hallways, the sound of hammers echoing through gilded chambers where they were supposed to be entertaining each other in refined elegance. They lived in a construction zone for decades. Some apartments had no windows yet. Others had no heat. Privacy was impossible. There weren't enough rooms for everyone, so nobles of lower ranks slept in converted storage spaces or attics. Some rented rooms in the village of Versailles and commuted to the palace daily. And they couldn't complain. Because complaining suggested that the king's vision was flawed. And questioning the king's vision was unthinkable. The gardens required even more impossible engineering. André Lenotre, the landscape architect, designed parterres and fountains and tree-lined alleys that imposed geometric perfection on nature itself. But geometry required flat ground. And Versailles sat on uneven terrain with poor drainage. So they moved the earth. Tens of thousands of cubic meters of soil excavated from hills and used to fill low areas. Entire forests were relocated, mature trees dug up and replanted to create instant shade along the planned walkways. Many trees died. More were brought in. Cost was irrelevant. Water was the biggest challenge. Lenotre's design required fountains, dozens of them. Eventually, 50 fountains with 620 water jets, spectacular displays that would showcase French engineering mastery and literally make water dance for the king's amusement. The problem was simple. Versailles had no water source capable of supporting that many fountains. The solution was expensive and absurd. In 1681, construction began on the Machine de Marly. an enormous hydraulic system designed to pump water from the Seine River, 14 kilometers away, up a hill to Versailles. The machine required 14 water wheels, 221 pumps, and enough wooden piping to stretch across the countryside. It was one of the most complex mechanical systems built in the 17th century. It cost 3.5 million livres to build, more than many European kingdoms spent on their entire militaries in a year. And it still didn't work properly. Even running constantly, the machine de Marly couldn't supply enough water to run all the fountains at once. So a system was developed. Servants watched from hidden positions in the gardens. When the king approached a particular fountain during his walks, they would signal ahead. Valves would open. That fountain would activate just before Louis arrived and shut off just after he passed, conserving water for the next fountain on his route. The king never knew. He walked through gardens where water seemed to spring to life at his approach, responding to his very presence. Divine power made visible through hydraulics and hidden servants turning valves. But it was all a trick, an enormously expensive trick that required constant maintenance and armies of workers monitoring water pressure and rushing to fix leaks. By Versailles, 1685, Versailles had consumed approximately 50 million livres, more than the annual revenue of the entire kingdom. And construction was far from finished. Louis XIV's finance ministers begged him to slow down. France was at war. The War of the League of Augsburg would drain the treasury from 1688 to 1697. The country needed funds for soldiers, for ships, for weapons, not for more gold leaf and marble floors. Louis did slow down, but he didn't stop. Even during wartime, when French peasants were starving and tax collectors were squeezing every sou from the Third Estate, work continued at Versailles. At reduced pace, yes. With fewer workers, yes. But the palace kept growing. By the time Louis XIV died in 1715, Versailles had cost, by the most conservative estimates, over 100 million livres. Some historians suggest the real figure approached 120 million livres or more, factoring in indirect costs like the machine de Marly and the infrastructure built to support construction. In today's money, adjusted for inflation and comparative buying power, that's somewhere between $2 billion and $3 billion USD. On a palace, for one man, in an era when most of his subjects couldn't afford to eat bread. The question is simple. Was Louis XIV insane? Delusional? Couldn't he see that he was destroying his own kingdom to build a monument to his ego? He saw. He understood perfectly. And he did it anyway. Because for Louis XIV, Versailles was never just a palace. It was the machine that would make absolute monarchy function, a tool designed to break the nobility and concentrate all power in the king's hands. And for a time it worked. Part 2. The Machine of Absolute Power. Stand at the gates of Versailles in 1700. What you're seeing is not architecture. It's a trap. The palace by now is substantially complete. The Hall of Mirrors gleams, the gardens stretch to the horizon. The wings extend far enough to house thousands. And inside, the greatest nobles of France are trapped like insects in amber, their lives controlled minute by minute by the man they call the Sun King. This is what Louis XIV built Versailles to do. Not to be beautiful, to be a cage. The theory was elegant. For centuries, French kings had struggled with the same problem. Powerful nobles who controlled vast territories, commanded private armies, and could challenge royal authority whenever they felt threatened or ambitious. The Fronde had proven how dangerous this decentralization could be. Louis's solution was revolutionary. Instead of fighting the nobility's power directly, he would seduce it. He would create a social system so alluring, so essential to status and advancement, that nobles would willingly abandon their provincial power bases to compete for meaningless honors at court. Versailles was the bait, and the nobility swallowed it. The system worked through proximity. The king's favor determined everything: military commands, church appointments, tax exemptions, pensions, marriages, inheritances. And favor could only be won by being present, by being seen, by performing elaborate rituals of submission disguised as etiquette. Between 3,000 and 10,000 people lived at or regularly attended Versailles, depending on the day and season. This included the royal family, high nobility, church officials, government ministers, lesser nobles, servants, guards, and the inevitable hangers-on who appeared at any center of power. But only a few hundred really mattered. The great families of France, dukes and princes, marquises and counts, people whose ancestors had fought at Agincourt or Bouvines, whose coats of arms dated back centuries. Under the old system, these families had been nearly autonomous rulers of their own regions. At Versailles, they became glorified servants. The day began with the livres, the ceremonial awakening of the king. This was not a private moment. This was theater. At 8:30 a.m., the first valet de chambre would enter the king's bedroom and announce, "Sire, it is time." Louis would wake, or pretend to wake, since he'd often been awake for some time, and the ritual would begin. A doctor and surgeon entered to examine him. Were there any signs of illness, discomfort? This wasn't medical care. It was a public demonstration that the king's body, like everything else in France, was functioning correctly. Then came the shaving. The barber approached with razor and bowl. Every motion rehearsed, every tool laid out with precision. And then the dressing. This was where rank really mattered. Only the highest-ranking person in the room had the honor of handing the king his shirt. This wasn't just custom. This was the prize that powerful men competed for. Dukes jockeyed for position. Princes of the blood insisted on their rights. The privilege of handing a shirt to a man who could dress himself became a symbol of favor worth more than gold. Next came the coat, the cravat, the wig. Each item handed over by a different courtier based on a hierarchy so complex that courtiers studied it like lawyers studying precedent. About 100 servants were involved in various capacities in these morning rituals. Not because Louis needed 100 people to help him dress, but because having 100 people participate demonstrated exactly how much power he wielded. The petit lever, conducted inside the king's bedchamber with only the highest ranks present, was followed by the grand lever, where Louis emerged into the state apartments and a crowd of courtiers waited for a glimpse of him. Just a glimpse. Just to be seen seeing the king, because being present mattered. Absence was noticed, and those who were noticed to be absent found their requests denied, their petitions ignored, their fortunes declining. Then came Mass at 10 a.m., a formal procession through the Hall of Mirrors, courtiers lining the route, hoping to catch the king's eye, to receive a nod or a word that could change their lives. Between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., Louis met with ministers and officials on matters of state. This was actual governing, though even here, ceremony mattered. Who was admitted to these meetings? Who stood where? Who was invited to speak? Every detail signaled rank and favor. Then hunting. Louis was his father's son in this. Most afternoons, weather permitting, he rode out with a band of senior aristocrats to hunt deer in the vast parks surrounding Versailles. This wasn't recreation. It was networking. The men who rode closest to the king, who were invited to ride at all, gained access and influence. Dinner at 10 p.m. Another ceremony, the grand couvert. The king and queen dined publicly, while courtiers watched. If you wanted to attend, you had to dress properly. Men had to wear swords. Didn't have one? You could rent one at the entrance. Fashion mattered enormously. Louis supported French textile industries and demanded courtiers wear French-made clothing. Once, he burned his son's coat because it wasn't made of French cloth. The women's dresses were equally regulated. Specific styles for specific occasions. Particular colors reserved for certain ranks. The tight corsets and elaborate silks were uncomfortable, sometimes painful. But suffering for fashion was suffering to demonstrate loyalty to the king's aesthetic vision. And where you sat, or if you sat at all, depended entirely on rank. Princes and princesses had chairs. Certain dukes could sit on stools, tabourets. Everyone else stood, for hours, watching other people eat. Elderly nobles stood through entire meals because sitting without permission would be a devastating breach of etiquette. Women had special servants who carried their tabourets around, ready to place them if suddenly the person's rank or the room's composition changed to allow sitting. This was not hospitality. This was a system designed to make grown adults obsess over furniture. After dinner, entertainments, music, theater, cards, conversation. The king might play billiards or gamble. Courtiers hovered, hoping for a word, a smile, an acknowledgement. The competition was relentless and exhausting. Finally, the coucher, the ceremonial bedtime, the reverse of the morning's lever, the same hierarchy, the same jockeying for position, the same careful performance of watching the king remove his clothing and prepare for sleep. And then, at last, the courtiers could return to their own rooms. If they had rooms. Many didn't. This schedule played out every single day, with variations for specific holy days or celebrations. But the core remained constant. The king's life was regimented, and because the court's life revolved around the king's, everyone's life was regimented. Louis XIV once said, "L'état, c'est moi." I am the state. At Versailles, that was literally true. The state was wherever the king was, and the king was always performing. But what about the nobles themselves? Why did they accept this? Some had no choice. Falling out of favor meant financial ruin. The crown controlled church appointments, military positions, judgeships, administrative posts. If your family depended on crown patronage, and most noble families did, you couldn't afford to leave Versailles. Others were seduced by the game itself. The competition for favor became addictive. Court life was gossip, intrigue, alliance building, subtle warfare fought with fashion and etiquette instead of swords. For people raised to value honor and status above almost everything else, Versailles offered a stage where those qualities could be displayed and tested daily. And some genuinely believed in the system. Louis XIV promoted an ideology of divine right monarchy. The king was God's appointed representative on earth. Serving the king was serving God. Questioning the king was questioning the divine order. For faithful Catholics raised in this worldview, submission to Louis wasn't just politically wise, it was spiritually necessary. The Duc de Saint-Simon lived at Versailles for more than 30 years. His memoirs give us the most detailed insider account of court life, and they reveal something fascinating. Saint-Simon hated much of what he saw. He criticized the king's policies, he condemned the waste and corruption, and he still couldn't leave. Because leaving meant irrelevance. And for a duke, irrelevance was a kind of death. So they stayed, they competed, they performed, and they became exactly what Louis wanted. Domesticated aristocrats whose energy went into jockeying for tabourets instead of raising armies against the crown. From a purely political standpoint, the system was brilliant. The Fronde-era nobility, who had nearly toppled the monarchy, were neutered Their regional power bases withered as they spent years at Versailles. Their private armies dissolved. Their ability to resist royal authority evaporated. Absolute monarchy, the concentration of all power in the king's person, became reality. Not through violence, through etiquette. But the cost was staggering, and we're not just talking about money. The human cost of Versailles wasn't limited to the workers who died building it. It extended to everyone trapped inside its golden cage. For the servants, life was brutal. We'll explore their world in detail soon. But understand this. The palace required approximately 2,500 full-time servants just to function. Another several thousand part-time workers came from the village of Versailles daily. They fed everyone. They cleaned 700 rooms. They tended 1,150 fireplaces. They emptied chamber pots, because despite the grandeur, there was almost no plumbing. They pressed clothes, polished silver, carried messages, lit candles, and performed 10,000 other tasks that made the nobles' lives seem effortless. And they were invisible. The palace was designed with hidden servants' corridors running parallel to the public halls. Staff could move through the building without ever being seen by the nobles. Doors were concealed behind wall panels. Staircases hidden. The machinery of service stayed out of sight. When a noble rang a bell, a servant appeared as if by magic. When a fire needed tending, someone materialized to stoke it. When a meal was required, it simply arrived. The nobles never had to witness the labor that sustained them. This invisibility was enforced. Servants who were noticed, who made noise, who appeared at the wrong time, who disrupted the illusion of effortless luxury, could be dismissed instantly. And dismissal meant losing not just employment, but housing, references, and any hope of working in a great household again. For the nobility themselves, life was equally constrained, just in different ways. They lived in splendor, yes, but they had no privacy whatsoever. None. Even sex was semi-public. When a royal couple consummated their marriage, witnesses were required to verify the act. Courtiers literally watched from outside bed curtains to ensure the marriage was legitimate. Royal births happened with crowds present. The queen labored and delivered while nobles jammed into the room, sometimes standing on furniture to get a better view. This wasn't perversion. It was politics. Royal legitimacy depended on unquestionable bloodlines. So privacy, even in the most intimate moments, was impossible. For lesser nobles, privacy was equally absent for different reasons. The apartments were crowded, walls were thin, gossip spread instantly. Affairs, debts, feuds, everything became public knowledge within hours. A society of thousands, many with nothing to do but observe and report on each other, created an atmosphere of constant surveillance. And you couldn't leave. Well, you could physically leave. But leaving without the king's permission was a statement. It meant you didn't care about favor. It meant you weren't competing. It meant you were declining in importance. Louis kept track of who attended court and who was absent. His comment about absences became famous. C'est un homme que je ne vois jamais. He is a man I never see. A dismissal. A death sentence for ambition. So they stayed, month after month, year after year, trapped in a palace that was beautiful and suffocating at once. The financial burden on nobles was immense. Living at Versailles meant maintaining appearances. The right clothes, the right servants, the right furniture for your apartment. Gambling debts, because card games were a primary social activity, and refusing to gamble suggested you couldn't afford to lose. Many nobles went broke trying to keep up. Their estates back in the provinces generated income. But that income was consumed by the costs of court life. Some borrowed ruinously. Others married for money, sacrificing family alliances for cash to fund their next season at Versailles. The king's pets, yes, pets, had an allowance of 1,446 livres per year, roughly $2,500 in modern terms. Royal bakers made treats for the king's dogs daily. Meanwhile, lesser nobles struggled to afford the silk coats they needed to appear at dinner. Animals, both royal and otherwise, were everywhere. The king's menagerie held elephants and flamingos, but feral animals also roamed the palace and grounds. Rats in the walls, stray cats and dogs lounging in hallways. Courtiers stepped around animal waste as casually as they stepped around puddles. Because there was no plumbing, the king had a bathroom, a rare luxury. But most nobles relied on chamber pots. And when chamber pots were full, or when they simply couldn't reach one in time, people relieved themselves in hallways, corners, behind tapestries. The smell was legendary. Versailles stank. Perfume wasn't just fashion, it was survival. Courtiers doused themselves in scent to mask the odor of human and animal waste that permeated the building. This was the palace that symbolized French civilization and refinement, where people shit in corners and covered it with perfume and pretended not to notice. The contradiction was deliberate. Louis XIV understood that luxury and discomfort could coexist. In fact, making nobles uncomfortable, making them compete for basic dignity, like a place to sit or a private moment to relieve themselves, reinforced their dependence. If the palace had been genuinely comfortable, nobles might have relaxed. They might have felt secure. Louis wanted them anxious, competing, desperate for his approval. And it worked. For decades, it worked beautifully. France under Louis XIV became the dominant power in Europe. French armies won wars. French culture set the standard for elegance and sophistication. The French language became the language of diplomacy and high society across the continent. Versailles itself became the model. Every monarch in Europe wanted their own version. Austria built Schönbrunn, Russia built Peterhof, Prussia built Sanssouci, all of them copying, on varying scales, what Louis had created. But every copy made the same mistake Louis did. They confused the appearance of power with sustainable power. They thought that building a magnificent palace would make them magnificent kings. They were wrong. Because underneath all that gold, all that marble, all those mirrors and fountains and perfectly trimmed hedges, the machine Louis built had a fatal flaw. It was too expensive to maintain. Part 3. The Invisible Army Dawn at Versailles. 4:30 a.m. The palace sleeps, or appears to. In the darkness, hundreds of bodies are already moving. Not nobles, not courtiers, servants. The invisible army that makes luxury possible. The kitchen maids rise first. They light the massive coal ranges in the basement kitchens. These iron beasts heat the ovens and water for the entire day's cooking. The work is brutal. Coal dust fills lungs. Heat radiates at unbearable levels, even in winter. Burns are constant, from hot pans, steam, the ranges themselves. By 5 a.m., scullery maids are hauling buckets of water despite the palace's modern plumbing. The water system exists, yes, but it's temperamental and insufficient. Much of the water for washing, for cooking, for the 1,000 tasks that require it, still moves by hand. Housemaids spread through the public rooms. 700 rooms. Every grate must be cleaned. Every fireplace laid with fresh wood and kindling. Every surface dusted. The mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors, all 357 of them, must be polished until they gleam. Perfection is not optional. The work must be finished before 8:30 a.m., when the king wakes, before the nobles begin emerging from their apartments. The palace must appear as if it maintains itself, as if dust doesn't settle, fires don't go cold, disorder doesn't naturally creep in overnight. The servants achieve this miracle every single day, and most of them will never be acknowledged for it. Let's be clear about the numbers. At full operation, Versailles employed approximately 2,500 full-time residential servants. But the real workforce was larger. Another several thousand non-residential workers commuted from the village of Versailles daily. These included many of the groundskeepers who maintained the 2,000-acre gardens, the stable hands who cared for hundreds of horses, the workers who operated the machine de marly and the complex fountain systems. The residential servants lived in the Grande Commune, a massive building designed by Jules Hardouin Mansart specifically to house them. Finished in 1684, the Grande Commune measured 82 meters by 76 meters, roughly the size of a large city block. It contained 6 floors plus attic space. In theory, this should have been adequate. In practice, it became a slum. When Louis XV returned to Versailles in 1722 after the Regency period, nearly 1,500 people lived in the Grande Commune, not counting non-residential staff who worked there daily. The 103 apartments built in 1684 had been divided and subdivided until 220 apartments existed by 1722. And they kept subdividing. Walls were thrown up to create smaller spaces. Mezzanines were built between floors to squeeze in more rooms. The attic and roof spaces, originally intended for storage, became living quarters. The conditions deteriorated rapidly. Some rooms were so small a grown man could barely stand upright. Ventilation was poor to non-existent. Heat in summer became unbearable. Cold in winter seeped through inadequate insulation. Servants who were fortunate enough to have rooms in the palace proper, tucked into corners, converted closets, narrow spaces under staircases, lived in equally cramped conditions. Often 4 servants shared a room smaller than a modern walk-in closet. Each morning, they packed away their bedding and began their work. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space was a fantasy. You shared air, sounds, smells, and every intimate detail of your life with people you might not even like. The hierarchy among servants was as rigid and complex as the hierarchy among nobles. At the top stood the maître d'hôtel, steward, and the contrôleur de la maison, du roi, controller of the king's household. These were powerful positions. They managed budgets, supervised hundreds of workers, and had direct access to the king when necessary. Below them came the valets and ladies' maids, those who dressed the royal family and high nobles, handled personal possessions, maintained wardrobes. These positions required skill and offered proximity to power. A valet who served the king directly held significant influence because they heard conversations, saw documents, understood the king's moods. Then came the footmen and housemaids. They served meals, cleaned rooms, carried messages, respectable positions, but without the access or influence of the valets. Below them, the kitchen staff. Cooks held some status if they were skilled, but the army of prep cooks, scullery maids, and pot washers existed at the bottom of the food chain. This hierarchy determined everything: where you ate, what you ate, how you were addressed, whether you had any hope of advancement or were stuck forever at the bottom. Upper servants, the stewards, valets, ladies' maids, ate separately from lower servants. They had better food, served on better plates, at tables where conversation was permitted. They could sit while eating. Lower servants ate quickly, standing or on rough benches with basic rations. Speak too much, take too long, and you'd be noticed. Being noticed meant being vulnerable to criticism and punishment. The food itself was a bitter reminder of the gap between those who served and those who were served. The nobles upstairs dined on elaborate multi-course meals. Roasted meats, fresh vegetables, exotic spices, delicate pastries, wine from the royal cellars. The servants ate thin soups, coarse bread, whatever vegetables were cheapest. Meat was rare and of poor quality. The portions were calculated to provide just enough energy to work, nothing more. Malnutrition was common. So was disease. Tuberculosis spread through the crowded servants' quarters, typhus, dysentery, fevers. Without proper nutrition, without rest, without clean living conditions, servants' immune systems couldn't fight off the infections that circulated constantly in a building housing thousands. Some servants stayed for decades despite these conditions. Why? For some, the pay was genuinely better than alternatives. Factory work was brutal and unstable. Farm labor was seasonal and dependent on harvests. Domestic service at Versailles offered steady wages and some prestige. You could tell your family back in the village that you worked for the king. That mattered in a world where status was everything. The pay varied enormously by position. The maître d'hôtel might earn several thousand livres per year. A skilled cook, 500, 800 livres. A footman, perhaps 200, 300 livres. A scullery maid, 50, 80 livres. Compare that to the king's dogs, whose allowance alone was 1,246 livres per year. Some servants advanced through the ranks. A scullery maid who proved capable and caught the right person's attention might become a kitchen maid. Then, eventually, a cook. A footman could become a valet. These promotions brought better pay, better living conditions, and the possibility of tips from grateful nobles. Tips, actually, were crucial. Officially, servants were paid by the crown. Unofficially, much of their real income came from the nobles they served directly. A valet who pleased his noble master might receive gifts, cash, even a pension upon the noble's death. This created another layer of dependency. Servants competed to serve the most generous nobles, and nobles used tips and gifts to secure loyalty. A servant who knew secrets, who could be trusted, who performed flawlessly, was valuable. Buying that loyalty with money was a small price. But the flip side was equally true. A servant could be dismissed at any moment for almost any reason. An error, a perceived slight, a personality clash with a superior. Dismissal meant instant loss of income, housing, and worst of all, references. Without a good reference from Versailles, finding another position in a great household became nearly impossible. You'd be reduced to manual labor or begging. For servants who had spent years building a career, dismissal was catastrophic. So they accepted the conditions: the cramped quarters, the long hours, the invisibility, the knowledge that they were absolutely replaceable. The work itself was backbreaking and relentless. Consider the fireplaces, 1,150 of them. Each one had to be cleaned, laid with fresh wood, and lit before the nobles woke. During winter, all of them burned. That's 1,250 fires to maintain, feed with wood throughout the day, and clean again each evening. The wood had to be cut, dried, stored, and hauled to each fireplace. Ashes had to be removed and disposed of. In a building this size, the logistics of simply keeping everyone warm consumed dozens of workers' entire days. Or consider the laundry. Thousands of people living in the palace and attending court meant mountains of clothing, linens, tablecloths, and napkins to wash. The laundry facilities operated constantly. Women scrubbed in hot water with harsh soap that destroyed their hands, wringing out heavy, wet fabric-strained backs and shoulders. Hanging everything to dry, then pressing it with heavy irons heated on stoves, took hours more. And it never stopped. As soon as one load was finished, the next arrived. The kitchens were their own kind of hell. The basement kitchen stretched across an area larger than most peasant villages. Multiple rooms, each dedicated to different tasks. Roasting rooms, baking rooms, pastry preparation, storage for perishables, chilled by ice when available, which wasn't often. The head chef commanded teams of sous chefs and prep cooks. During major dinners, dozens of people worked simultaneously preparing dozens of dishes. The timing had to be perfect. Courses appeared in sequence, everything at the correct temperature. But the king's dining room was far from the kitchens. Food traveled through long corridors, upstairs, across the palace. By the time it reached the table, everything was cold. This frustrated Louis XIV. He loved food and wanted hot meals. But the distance was too great, the journey too long. Even with hundreds of servants employed just in food service, even with the most efficient systems they could devise, physics defeated them. The King of France, the most powerful man in Europe, the master of Versailles, frequently ate cold food. It's almost funny. Except the servants were blamed. Why is this cold? A reasonable question with an obvious answer. The kitchens are half a kilometer from the dining room. But the answer didn't matter. The king was displeased. Servants scrambled to find solutions that didn't exist. The hidden servants' corridors were a marvel of design and a symbol of the broader philosophy. These narrow passages ran parallel to the grand halls. Servants could move through the palace without being seen, carrying trays, cleaning supplies, chamber pots, whatever was needed. Concealed doors in the walls allowed them to appear and disappear as if by magic. A noble would ring a bell. Moments later, a servant would emerge from what appeared to be solid paneling. The illusion was that service happened spontaneously, that the palace responded to needs through some divine mechanism rather than human labor. Maintaining this illusion required constant awareness. Servants learned the schedules of every noble whose rooms they tended. They learned to move silently, to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to be present when required and absent otherwise. Being visible at the wrong time, being noticed as a person rather than a function, could end your career. The relationship between nobles and servants was complex and often disturbing. Some nobles treated servants with relative kindness. Marie Antoinette, despite her reputation for extravagance, was known to be genuinely fond of her chambermaids. She called one "my good Rosalie" and relied on her for emotional support. Other nobles were cruel. The Marquis de Sade, though an extreme example, represents the darker possibilities. Servants were legally and practically vulnerable. A noble could abuse them physically, sexually, emotionally, with little fear of consequences. Most abuse was subtler. Contempt, dismissiveness, treating servants as furniture that happened to move and occasionally speak. This casual dehumanization was arguably worse than outright cruelty because it was universal and normalized. You don't beat a chair when it displeases you. You just replace it. Despite everything, a strange pride existed among some servants. Working at Versailles, even in terrible conditions, meant you were part of the greatest palace in Europe. You contributed to something magnificent. The nobles you served were the most important people in France. Being connected to that, even as a servant, offered a kind of reflected glory. This pride made the system sustainable. If servants had universally hated their work, if they'd all seen themselves as exploited victims, rebellion would have been inevitable. But many internalized the hierarchy. They believed, or convinced themselves they believed, that serving the king was honorable, that their suffering had meaning. Maybe it's easier to survive suffering if you can tell yourself it matters. The children of servants often became servants themselves. It was an inherited profession in many families. You grew up at Versailles, watching your parents work. You learned the routines, the expectations. When you came of age, you entered service naturally. This created dynasties of servants, families who had served for generations. Some took pride in this continuity, others saw it as a trap. But either way, escape was difficult. Where else could they go? Back to villages where opportunities were even more limited. Into cities where factory work was as brutal and even less stable. Domestic service at Versailles was a cage. But it was a cage with bars made of economic necessity as much as physical walls. The truly horrifying part is that compared to many servants in France during this period, Versailles workers had it relatively good. They were paid regularly, which couldn't be said for servants in many noble households. They were fed, even if the food was poor. They had shelter, even if crowded and uncomfortable. They had some chance of advancement, even if slim. This wasn't kindness, it was efficiency. The palace required skilled, experienced workers. High turnover would have disrupted operations, so conditions were maintained at a level just tolerable enough to keep people from fleeing en masse. It was exploitation, but calculated exploitation, not sadism, business. And the servants kept the machine running every day, every night, for decades, until the machine broke. And when it did, when revolution came and the mob marched on Versailles, many servants fled or disappeared into the chaos. Some stayed. Because even in revolution, even as nobles were dragged to the guillotine, even as the world they'd known collapsed, they had nowhere else to go. The palace that had housed them worked them nearly to death, and treated them as invisible became their only reality. They couldn't imagine anything else. That's what systems like Versailles do. They don't just exploit bodies. They colonize minds. They make people believe that the cage is the only possible world. Part 4. The Price of Glory. By 1700, Versailles was complete enough to function as Louis XIV intended. The court was permanent. The nobles were domesticated. The gardens were perfection incarnate. Fountains danced. Gold gleamed. Power radiated from every mirror and marble floor. And France was going broke. Let's talk about the money. Because the money is where the fantasy collided with mathematics. And mathematics always wins. The construction and early maintenance of Versailles cost at least 100 million livres between 1661 and 1715. Some estimates push toward 120 million. The exact figure is unclear because Louis XIV deliberately obscured the accounts. He knew the costs were obscene. He knew revealing them would trigger outrage. So he buried them in various budgets, split across different ministries, hidden in creative accounting. But even conservative estimates are staggering. France's total annual revenue in the late 1600s was roughly 150 and 200 million livres in good years. So Versailles consumed somewhere between half and two-thirds of an entire year's revenue of the entire kingdom for one building. And that's just construction. Ongoing operations were equally expensive. Running Versailles required approximately 5 to 6% of France's annual budget in peacetime during Louis XIV's later reign. In some years, when additional renovations were underway, the figure reached 8–10%. Think about that. Nearly 1/10 of everything France collected in taxes went to maintaining a single palace. Not defending the country, not building infrastructure, not feeding the poor or funding schools or improving agriculture. Maintaining a palace so the king could perform elaborate rituals and the nobility could compete over who got to hold his shirt. The money went everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It paid for the 500 residential servants and several thousand more non-residential workers. It bought coal by the ton to feed 1,150 fireplaces. It purchased food for the elaborate meals. It maintained the fountains and gardens. It funded repairs, constant, never-ending repairs to a building so large that something was always breaking. It paid for candles, thousands of candles. The palace burned through them at an astonishing rate. Before electric light, every room had to be lit with candles or oil lamps. A single evening's entertainment might consume hundreds of candles. The annual candle budget alone was enough to fund a small army. It paid for the courtiers' pensions. Louis XIV granted pensions to nobles to keep them dependent and loyal. These weren't small gifts. Some pensions reached 10,000 or 20,000 livres per year. Multiply that by hundreds of courtiers, and the cost became enormous. Where did the money come from? Taxes, always taxes. France's tax system in the 17th and 8th centuries was brutally unfair. The population was divided into 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy, perhaps 130,000 people, less than 1% of France's 20 million people. The second estate was the nobility, roughly 400,000 people, about 2% of the population. The third estate was everyone else: peasants, urban workers, the bourgeoisie, about 97% of the population. The first and second estates were largely exempt from direct taxation. They had privileges, rights granted by custom and law, that protected their wealth. The clergy collected tithes from peasants, but paid minimal taxes too. The crown. The nobility owned about 25 to 30% of France's land, but contributed almost nothing to royal revenues. The entire tax burden fell on the third estate. The taille, the main direct tax, applied only to commoners. The gabelle, a tax on salt, essential for preserving food, hit the poor hardest because they spent a larger percentage of income on basics. Indirect taxes on goods, tolls on roads and bridges, feudal obligations to local lords. All of this crushed the peasantry, and the peasantry couldn't escape. They were bound to the land, required to work for their lords, subject to obligations that dated back centuries. The feudal system was theoretically dead, but its ghost haunted every village in France. A peasant family might work their entire lives and never accumulate wealth. Taxes took 50 to 60% of their income in some regions. After taxes, after feudal obligations, after buying seed for next year's planting, they had almost nothing. And that money flowed toward Versailles, toward gold leaf and fountains, toward pensions for nobles who had never worked a day in their lives, toward maintaining a palace that existed to glorify one man. The distance between the suffering and the splendor was less than a day's walk. 20 kilometers. Peasants in villages around Versailles could see the palace from their fields. They could watch the gardens grow while their children went hungry. Did Louis XIV see this? Did he understand? He saw. He understood. And he didn't care. Not because he was a monster, but because he genuinely believed in the divine right of kings. God had placed him on the throne. His glory was France's glory. Maintaining his magnificence maintained France's position in the world. The suffering of peasants was regrettable but necessary, inevitable, the natural order of things. This wasn't unusual thinking for the era. Most European monarchs believed something similar. But most European monarchs weren't spending half of annual revenues on a palace. The pressure on France's finances intensified with every war, and Louis XIII fought a lot of wars. The War of Devolution, 1667-1668. The Franco-Dutch War, 1672-1678. The War of the Reunions, 1683-1684. The 9 Years' War, 1688-1697. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714. Decades of near-constant warfare. Some wars were successful and expanded French territory. Others were expensive stalemates. All of them drained the treasury. Military spending consumed 40–50% of France's budget during wartime, sometimes more. When you add Versailles' 5–10%, you're looking at more than half of all revenue going to two things: fighting wars and maintaining a palace. Everything else, roads, bridges, poor relief, legal systems, local administration, had to function on whatever was left, which often wasn't much. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister from 1665 to 1683, was a genius at finding money. He reformed tax collection to reduce corruption. He developed French industry to increase exports and decrease imports. He built up the navy and established overseas colonies. But even Colbert couldn't make the math work. He begged Louis to reduce spending at Versailles. He presented detailed budgets showing the impossibility of sustaining both the palace and the military. He argued that France's long-term prosperity required investment in infrastructure and industry, not gilding. Louis listened politely and ignored him. Work at Versailles slowed during the worst years of the 9 Years' War. But it never stopped. The king would cut military spending before he'd cut palace spending. Colbert died in 1683, exhausted and frustrated. His successors faced the same impossible task. France needed reform. Tax reform. Structural reform. The nobility needed to pay their share. The system that exempted the wealthiest from taxation while crushing the poorest was economically insane and morally obscene. But reform was politically impossible. The nobility would never voluntarily give up their tax exemptions. The parlements, regional courts dominated by nobles, would block any attempt to impose direct taxes on the aristocracy. And Louis XIV wouldn't force the issue because doing so would undermine the very system Versailles was built to support. The machine ate itself. By the early 1700s, France was deep in debt. The exact figure is unclear. Again, creative accounting obscures the reality. But estimates suggest the national debt reached 2 to 3 billion livres by the time Louis XIV died in 1715. Interest payments on that debt consumed 50% or more of annual revenue in some years. Half the budget just servicing debt. Not paying it down, just covering interest. This was unsustainable. Everyone knew it. Ministers knew it. Nobles knew it, though they pretended not to. Even Louis XIV, in his final years, must have understood that he was leaving his successor a financial disaster. He died on September 1st, 1715, 4 days before his 77th birthday. He had reigned for 72 years, longer than any European monarch before or since. His reign had transformed France into the dominant cultural and military power on the continent. It had also bankrupted the kingdom. His great-grandson, Louis XV, inherited the throne at age 5. And he inherited Versailles, magnificent and ruinous, a palace that demanded constant feeding while providing nothing but symbolic returns. The regency period under Philippe d'Orléans, 1715–1723, saw some relief. The court moved back to Paris temporarily. Versailles sat largely empty. The Duke of Noailles even proposed demolishing it, just tearing down the whole absurd complex and salvaging the materials. The proposal was rejected, because by then, Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a symbol. France's greatness was tied to its existence. Destroying it would be admitting that Louis XIV's vision had failed, and French pride couldn't accept that. So when Louis XIV returned to Versailles in 1722 at age 12, the palace sprang back to life. The court reconvened. The rituals resumed. The bills kept coming. Louis XV wasn't his great-grandfather. He didn't love Versailles the way Louis XIV had. He found it stifling and spent as much time as possible at other residences. The Petit Trianon, which he built for his mistress, Madame de Pompadour. Various hunting lodges, anywhere that offered relief from the crushing formality of the main palace. But he didn't dare abandon it completely. Versailles remained the seat of government and the center of court life. To leave permanently would signal weakness, would suggest the monarchy couldn't afford its own palace, couldn't maintain the standards Louis XIV had established. So Louis XV poured money into it. Not as much as his great-grandfather, he wasn't building new wings or expanding the gardens dramatically. But maintenance, renovations, updates. The Salon d'Hercule was completed. The opera was begun, though not finished until Louis XV's reign. Interior apartments were remodeled to suit changing tastes, and the costs never decreased. A palace this size deteriorates constantly. Stone erodes, wood rots, roofs leak, systems fail. You either spend money maintaining it or watch it crumble. There's no third option. Louis XV died in 1774. His reign had lasted 59 years, though much of the actual governing had been done by ministers. He left the treasury in worse shape than he'd inherited it. The national debt had grown. Reforms had stalled. The structural problems, the tax system, the exempted nobility, the crushing burden on the Third Estate, remained untouched. His grandson, Louis XV, became king at age 19. Young, well-meaning, genuinely interested in reform, but utterly unprepared for the catastrophe he'd inherited. Louis XVI looked at Versailles and saw a beautiful prison. He and Marie Antoinette, married in 1770, found court life oppressive. The endless ceremonies, the lack of privacy, the constant observation. They escaped when they could to the Petit Trianon, where Marie Antoinette created a fantasy village, the Hameau de la Reine, complete with a working farm, and hired peasants to tend it. The irony was lost on no one. The queen playing at being a peasant while real peasants starved, building a fake village while real villages collapsed. The Hameau cost hundreds of thousands of livres, money that could have fed thousands of real people. But Marie Antoinette wasn't evil. She was trapped, like everyone at Versailles, in a system that made genuine human connection almost impossible. The Hameau was her attempt to escape the artificiality of court life, to experience something that felt real. The tragedy is that she did this by creating another artifice, more elaborate, more expensive, more disconnected from the reality of French life than anything her husband's court had produced. Louis XVI tried to reform. He really did. He appointed finance ministers who understood the problem. Turgot, 1774-1776. Necker, 1777-1781 and 1788-1789. Calonne, 1783-1787. Each one diagnosed the same disease. France's tax system was broken. The nobility must be taxed. The debt must be addressed. Each reform attempt was blocked. The nobility refused to accept taxation. The parliaments refused to register edicts that would impose it. The clergy, wealthy and powerful, refused to give up their privileges. Louis XVI could have forced the issue. He was an absolute monarch, at least in theory. He could have imposed reforms by fiat, crushed resistance, made the nobility submit. But he wasn't his ancestors. He didn't have Louis XIV's ruthlessness or even Louis XV's cold detachment. He was kind, thoughtful, indecisive. He wanted consensus, not confrontation. He backed down when resistance grew fierce. So nothing changed, except the debt kept growing, and the people kept starving. In 1784, Louis XVI briefly considered moving the royal family to the Château de Saint-Cloud so that major renovations could be done at Versailles. The palace needed serious work. Systems installed in the 1680s were failing. The plumbing was a disaster. Entire wings needed updating. The renovations never began. Because in 1787, the financial crisis reached critical mass. France was effectively broke. The government couldn't borrow anymore. Creditors had lost confidence. Couldn't raise taxes through traditional means, the parliaments blocked them. Couldn't cut spending enough to matter. Interest on the debt was fixed. Military spending couldn't be reduced without weakening France's position in Europe, and Versailles still demanded its share. Calonne advised Louis XIV to call the Assembly of Notables, a gathering of high nobles, clergy, and important officials, to approve new taxes. The Assembly met. They refused. Why should they pay when they'd never had to before? Why should their privileges be taken away to fix a problem created by the Crown's mismanagement? The Assembly of Notables failed. In desperation, Louis XIV took a step that would prove fatal. In 1788, he announced that the Estates General would meet in May 1789. The Estates General hadn't convened since 1614, 175 years. It was a representative body where the three estates could voice grievances and theoretically advise the king. Louis hoped it would approve new taxes and solve the financial crisis. He didn't understand that calling the Estates General was like opening Pandora's box. Once the Third Estate had a platform, they weren't going to settle for approving a few taxes and going home. They were going to demand everything. The stage was set. The debt was crushing. The people were starving. The Palace at Versailles stood as a monument to the very excess and inequality that was about to destroy the monarchy. And in the winter of 1788-1789, bread prices started to rise. Not because of taxes or policy, because the harvest had failed. Poor weather, possibly triggered by the volcanic eruption in Iceland in 1783, had produced 2 consecutive bad harvests. Grain was scarce. Bread, the staple food for most French people, became expensive. In 1789, bread prices rose 88%, while real wages fell 25%. Peasants and urban workers faced a simple, terrible reality. They couldn't afford to eat, and their children were starving. While 20 kilometers away, Versailles glittered, untouched, indifferent. The palace that bankrupted the kingdom was about to learn that bankruptcy isn't just a financial condition, it's a reckoning, and reckonings are paid in blood. Part 5. The Reckoning, May 5th, 1789. The Estates General convenes at Versailles. 3 groups, 3 separate chambers, 3 different realities about to collide. The first estate, the clergy, arrives in their finest robes. Cardinals and bishops in crimson and gold. Lower clergy, parish priests who actually work among the poor, in simpler garb. The gap between high and low clergy is as stark as the gap between estates. The second estate, the nobility, processes in silk and lace. Swords at their sides, the ancient symbol of their military service to the crown. Though most of these nobles have never fought in a war, have never done anything but live off inherited wealth and crown pensions. They carry swords as costume, not as tools. The third estate arrives in black, deliberately plain, deliberately somber. 600 deputies representing 97% of France. Lawyers, merchants, prosperous farmers. The bourgeoisie who have money but no privilege, who pay taxes but have no voice, who've watched nobles live in splendor while they work and still barely prosper. The meeting begins in a grand hall at Versailles. The king speaks. He asks for patience, cooperation, quick approval of new taxes to save France from financial ruin. The third estate hears something else entirely. They hear a king asking them, once again, to pay for the nobility's exemptions, to cover the cost of palaces they'll never enter, to bail out a system that has exploited them for centuries. They refuse. Not loudly, not immediately, but firmly. We will not approve new taxes, they say, until France has a constitution, until the tax system is reformed, until the nobility loses its exemptions and everyone pays their fair share. The other estates are horrified. The king is confused. This wasn't the plan. They're supposed to debate for a few weeks, approve some reforms, go home, not demand a complete restructuring of French society. On June 17th, the Third Estate makes its move. They declare themselves the National Assembly, not the Third Estate, the National Assembly, representatives of the entire nation. And they announce they will not disband until France has a written constitution limiting royal power and establishing the rule of law. This is revolution. Not yet violent, but revolutionary nonetheless. The Third Estate has just rejected the entire social order. The three estates, the hierarchy that has governed France for centuries. The divine right of kings, all of it dismissed with a vote. Louis XIV panics. On June 20th, he orders the hall where the Third Estate meets to be locked. A clumsy power play. If they can't meet, they can't rebel. The deputies find themselves locked out. So they walk to the nearest large indoor space available, the Royal Tennis Court. And there, standing together in an indoor court where nobles played games, 600 men swear an oath. The tennis court oath. We will not separate, they vow, until we have given France a constitution. It's a direct challenge to the king's authority. Louis could have arrested them all, could have called in troops and crushed the rebellion before it spread. But he hesitates. He's not his ancestor. He doesn't want blood. He wants compromise. That hesitation dooms him. By late June, some deputies from the First and Second Estates are joining the National Assembly. Parish priests who've seen their parishioners starve. Liberal nobles who've read Enlightenment philosophy and believe in reform. The National Assembly is growing. On June 27th, Louis XIV officially recognizes it. A complete capitulation. He orders the remaining deputies from all three estates to join the National Assembly. Absolute monarchy. The system Louis XIV spent millions of livres and decades building has just died. Not through violence, through the king's own surrender. But the people of Paris don't know that yet. They see troops gathering around Versailles and Paris. They see the king dismissing reformist ministers. They believe, not unreasonably, that he's preparing to crush the National Assembly by force. Rumors spread. The king is about to arrest the deputies. He's going to starve Paris into submission. Foreign troops, German mercenaries, are coming to butcher French patriots. The rumors aren't all false. Louis has been calling up troops, not necessarily to attack, but to maintain order if things spiral out of control. But in the charged atmosphere of July 1789, the distinction doesn't matter. An army gathering looks like a threat. On July 14th, Parisians storm the Bastille, a fortress and prison that symbolizes royal tyranny. The governor is killed, his head paraded through the streets on a pike. The revolution has turned violent, but Versailles remains untouched. 20 kilometers away, the palace sits in its gardens, fountains still playing, nobles still performing their rituals. The violence is in Paris. Paris is a different world. That changes in October. Bread prices are still rising. Harvests are still failing. By October 1789, Parisian women, market women, laborers, wives of craftsmen, are desperate. Their children are starving. They've petitioned. They've protested. Nothing has changed. On October 5th, they gather at the Paris City Hall. Thousands of them, demanding action on bread prices, demanding the king do something, anything, to address the crisis. Possibly orchestrated by political figures like the Duke of Orléans and the Comte de Mirabeau, possibly spontaneous. History isn't clear. The crowd makes a decision. They will march to Versailles. They will confront the king and queen directly. 20 kilometers, on foot, in the rain, thousands of women, some armed with pikes and knives and kitchen tools. Not trained soldiers, not revolutionaries with a coherent plan. Mothers, wives, women who have reached the point where rage overcomes fear. They arrive at Versailles in the evening, muddy, exhausted, furious. They demand to meet with the king. A delegation is allowed inside to present their grievances. Louis XIV, to his credit, meets with them. He listens. He promises to address bread prices. He signs decrees. He tries to diffuse the situation. It's not enough. The crowd remains through the night. More people arrive from Paris, including National Guard units under Lafayette's command. The atmosphere is tense, volatile. Versailles, which has existed for a century in isolated splendor, is now surrounded by an armed mob. On the morning of October 6th, a small group of protesters breaks into the palace. They're looking for the Queen, Marie Antoinette, symbol of everything they hate about the monarchy. Extravagance, indifference, foreign influence. She's Austrian, always suspect in France. They find her apartments. She flees just in time, running through hidden passages to the king's chambers. Minutes later, they would have caught her. Guards are killed. Their heads are cut off and placed on pikes. The crowd is chanting, demanding, screaming. Lafayette, desperately trying to prevent a massacre, convinces the royal family to address the crowd from a balcony. Louis, Marie Antoinette, their children. They appear before thousands of armed, angry people. The crowd has one demand: return to Paris. Come back to the city, where we can watch you, where you can't hide behind gates and gardens. Louis XIV has no choice. His authority has collapsed. The National Guard, supposedly loyal to the crown, is siding with the people. The crowd won't leave without him. He agrees. On October 6, 1789, the royal family departs Versailles. Surrounded by the mob, guards marching with heads on pikes, women singing songs about punishing the Queen. The journey back to Paris is a nightmare parade. Versailles is left behind, empty. The nobles flee. The servants scatter. The palace, which has been the center of French political and social life for over a century, becomes a shell. The court never returns. Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette are installed in the Tuileries Palace in Paris. They're prisoners in all but name. The National Assembly moves to Paris as well. Versailles, the machine built to centralize and control power, sits abandoned. And the people who marched on it, the women who broke through the gates and invaded the Queen's apartments, had a simple message. You built this palace with our money, our labor, our suffering, and you gave us nothing. Not bread, not dignity, not even acknowledgement that we exist. Now you'll live in our city, under our watch. And if you ever forget again who actually sustains this kingdom, we'll remind you. The revolution spiraled from there. The National Assembly attempted to create a constitutional monarchy. It failed. Too much distrust, too many radicals demanding more extreme measures, too many foreign powers threatening to invade and restore absolute monarchy. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished. France became a republic. In January 1793, Louis XVIII was tried for treason, convicted, and executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. Marie Antoinette followed in October 1793. Her final journey was in a common cart, not a royal carriage. Crowds jeered. She maintained her dignity. And then the blade fell. The terror followed. Thousands executed. Nobles, clergy, anyone suspected of royalist sympathies. The revolution ate its own children. Robespierre, who'd led the radical Jacobins, ended up guillotined himself in 1794. Eventually, stability returned under Napoleon Bonaparte, who crowned himself emperor in 1804. But the old world was gone. The absolute monarchy, the divine right of kings, the system where 2% of the population held all the wealth and power, while 98% worked and starved. That world died at Versailles. Not literally. The actual deaths happened in Paris, in the prisons, at the guillotines. But symbolically, Versailles was where the breaking point was reached. The palace that was supposed to make the monarchy invincible made it vulnerable, because it concentrated all the visual evidence of inequality in one place. All the excess, all the waste, all the indifference. When peasants starving in their villages could look toward Versailles and see fountains running, gardens blooming, gold glittering, the contrast was too stark to ignore, too obscene to excuse, too infuriating to endure. Versailles didn't cause the French Revolution. The causes were complex. Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty, structural economic problems, bad harvests, the financial crisis caused by decades of war and mismanagement. But Versailles was the perfect symbol for everything that was wrong. And in revolutions, symbols matter, because symbols tell stories. And the story Versailles told was, this is what your suffering paid for. This is where your taxes went. While you couldn't afford bread, they had 50 fountains. That story was true. And once the people understood it, really understood it viscerally, in a way that made rage inevitable. No amount of stone and gold could protect the monarchy. The palace built to demonstrate absolute power instead demonstrated absolute disconnection from reality, from the governed, from basic human decency. And that disconnection was fatal. Part 6. The Aftermath. Versailles sat empty for years after the revolution. Abandoned, looted, vandalized. Revolutionary mobs stripped what they could, furniture sold or destroyed, art seized and moved to the Louvre or other museums. Anything valuable that could be removed was removed. Anything that couldn't be moved was often damaged out of rage. Here was the palace that symbolized royal excess. Now anyone could walk through its halls, spit on its floors, deface its walls. The illusion of untouchable grandeur collapsed instantly once the guards were gone. The National Convention debated what to do with the building. Some argued for complete demolition. Tear it down. Erase the symbol. Use the materials for something productive. Others wanted to preserve it as a museum, a monument to the revolution itself. Show future generations what the monarchy had built on the backs of the people. Let them walk through and see where kings had lived while the nation starved. The preservation argument won, partly because demolition would be expensive. The palace was enormous and solidly built. Partly because even revolutionaries recognized that Versailles represented French craftsmanship and artistry, not just royal excess. But for decades, Versailles existed in limbo, neither destroyed nor properly maintained. Various schemes to repurpose it came and went. Military barracks, arms manufacturing, government offices. None stuck. Napoleon considered making it a residence, but decided the associations were too problematic. He was building a new empire. He needed new symbols, not recycled monarchical ones. It wasn't until 1837, during the July monarchy under King Louis Philippe, that Versailles found a new identity. Louis Philippe transformed it into the Museum of the History of France. À toutes les gloires de la France. To all the glories of France. The palace became a celebration of French history and achievement. Not just the monarchy, not just the revolution, everything. Military victories, scientific discoveries, cultural accomplishments. Versailles would house it all, a physical timeline of French greatness. This was politically brilliant. It separated the building from its original purpose. Versailles was no longer the palace where kings had ruled. It was a museum where all French people could learn their shared history. The transformation required extensive restoration. Decades of neglect had taken their toll. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, systems failed. Louis-Philippe poured money into repairs, not to recreate the exact conditions of Louis XIV's era, that would be ideologically suspect, but to preserve the structure and adapt it for public use. The work continued for decades. Successive governments, through changing regimes, monarchy, republic, empire, republic again, kept funding Versailles' preservation. Because by then, it had become clear. This building mattered, not for what it had been, but for what it represented about France's capacity for grandeur and achievement. Today, Versailles welcomes over 10 million visitors per year, one of the most visited historic sites in the world. People come from every continent to walk through the Hall of Mirrors, to stroll the gardens, to see where Louis XIV performed his rituals and Marie Antoinette played at being a peasant. Modern maintenance costs approximately $20 million annually. That's just upkeep. Preserving the structure, keeping systems functional, managing the crowds. Major restoration projects cost far more. But the revenue from ticket sales, events, and merchandise makes Versailles roughly self-sustaining now. It pays its way. The palace that once drained a kingdom now funds its own preservation. The irony would amuse Louis XIV, or perhaps horrify him. His private palace is now a public museum. Commoners pay to walk where once only nobles tread. The rituals that once demonstrated absolute power are now explained by tour guides as historical curiosities. The invisibility he demanded from servants is now inverted. The servants' quarters, the hidden corridors, the infrastructure that made the illusion work. These are now part of the tour. Visitors see the basement kitchens, learn about the Grand Commune, hear about the workers who died building this place. The full story, not just the glory, the cost. This shift matters. For centuries, Versailles' story was told by the victors, by nobles, by courtiers, by those who benefited from the system. Their accounts emphasized beauty, power, and cultural achievement. The suffering was footnoted or ignored. Modern historiography tries to correct that imbalance, to acknowledge that every gold-leafed surface was paid for by someone's labor, that the magnificence was built on exploitation, that the beauty came with a body count. This isn't to say Versailles has no value. The artistry is real. The architectural innovation is real. The historical importance is unquestionable. But value and cost are not the same thing. Something can be beautiful and terrible simultaneously. Versailles is beautiful. It's also a monument to a system that crushed millions to glorify a few. Both things are true. History that acknowledges only one or the other is incomplete. So what do we learn from Versailles? First, symbolic power is not the same as real power. Louis XIV believed that if he could make the nobles submit to his rituals, he could control France indefinitely. For a time, it worked. But rituals can't stop bread prices from rising, can't balance budgets, can't make subjects love you when they're starving. The palace was a magnificent illusion. And when reality intruded, when harvests failed, when debt became unmanageable, when people had nothing left to lose, the illusion shattered. Second, systems that concentrate all benefits at the top are inherently unstable. The French tax system, which exempted those who could most afford to pay and crushed those who could least, was economically insane. Eventually, the bottom would break. When 97% of the population bears all the burden, while 3% enjoys all the privilege, revolution becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Versailles symbolized and enabled that concentration. By trapping the nobility in the palace, Louis XIV prevented them from seeing or caring about conditions in the provinces. They competed for tabourets while peasants starved. That disconnection made reform impossible until it was too late. Third, monuments outlast their builders, but not always their meanings. Louis XIV built Versailles to glorify absolute monarchy forever. It survived, but the monarchy didn't. The building now serves purposes its creator never imagined and would likely have despised. This isn't tragic, it's hopeful. It means that what we build can be reclaimed, repurposed, given new meaning by new generations. Versailles was redeemed by ceasing to be what it was created to be. Fourth, we don't have to choose between acknowledging beauty and acknowledging harm. Versailles is stunning. It's also built on bones. Both things matter. A history that celebrates the art while ignoring the workers is propaganda. A history that condemns the building while ignoring the craftsmanship is equally incomplete. The challenge is holding both truths simultaneously. This palace represents human achievement and human cruelty, French cultural brilliance and French social brutality, technical mastery and moral failure. That complexity is uncomfortable. It's easier to tell simple stories. Versailles is wonderful, or Versailles is wicked. But reality is messier. History is messier. And if we want to actually understand the past, rather than just use it to confirm our existing beliefs, we have to sit with that messiness. Fifth, the people who make the machine run are rarely the people who control it. Versailles functioned because of servants, laborers, workers whose names we don't know. They hauled stone, cleaned fireplaces, cooked meals, turned fountain valves, made the illusion of effortless grandeur possible. They weren't asked if this palace should exist, weren't consulted on design, didn't benefit from its completion. Many died building it, most lived in poverty serving it. And when revolution came, they were abandoned by the very nobles whose lives they'd sustained. That pattern repeats throughout history. Grand projects, ambitious visions, revolutionary transformations, always built on the backs of people whose contributions are erased or minimized, whose suffering is treated as acceptable collateral damage. Versailles demands we remember those people, not just as statistics, 5 deaths per week, 1,500 residential servants, but as human beings whose lives mattered as much as any king's. And finally, extravagance has consequences. Louis XIV spent half of France's annual revenue on Versailles. Louis XV and Louis XV kept pouring money into maintenance and renovations. For over a century, the palace consumed resources that could have built roads, improved agriculture, funded schools, or simply been left in the pockets of the people who earned them. That choice had consequences. Not immediately. Louis XIV died in his bed after 72 years of power. But eventually, the financial crisis that triggered the revolution was partly caused by Versailles. The rage that stormed the palace in 1789 was partly born from seeing where the money went. The palace that was supposed to make the monarchy invincible helped destroy it. Because you cannot indefinitely spend a kingdom's wealth on your own glory without eventually facing the people whose poverty paid for it. Versailles stands today as a warning as much as a wonder. Build something this magnificent on foundations this unjust, and eventually, the foundations crack. The palace survives. The system that created it does not. And that might be the most important lesson of all. Part 7. The Mirror Walk through Versailles today. The Hall of Mirrors still gleams. Sunlight streams through the windows on the garden side, bounces off 357 mirrors, and fills the space with light that feels almost divine. Tourists stand in wonder, phones raised, trying to capture something that refuses to be reduced to an image. This is what survives: beauty, craftsmanship, the undeniable evidence that human beings can create spaces that transcend mere function and become art. But step outside into the gardens. Look at the fountains. Read the plaques that explain how the water systems work, how servants monitored pressure and turned valves, how the machine de Marly pumped water across kilometers of countryside just to make water dance for a king. This is what also survives: evidence of the system, the infrastructure of illusion, the machinery that made luxury possible for a few by making exploitation mandatory for many. Versailles is a mirror. What you see depends on where you stand and what you're willing to look at. Stand in the Hall of Mirrors, and you see French civilization at its peak. Art, culture, refinement. Proof that monarchy could achieve something transcendent. That concentrated power, wealth, and vision could produce wonders. Stand in the servants' quarters and you see something else. Cramped rooms where 4 people slept in a space smaller than a closet. Narrow staircases worn smooth by countless feet carrying endless trays. The bones of a system built on making some humans invisible so others could shine. Both views are accurate. Neither is complete. The temptation is to choose, to decide that Versailles is either a triumph or a tragedy, to sort it into a simple moral category that requires no further thought. Resist that temptation, because the truth is harder and more important than simple judgments. Versailles is exceptional precisely because it embodies the full complexity of human civilization, our capacity for beauty and our capacity for cruelty, our genius for organization and our willingness to organize around injustice, our ability to create meaning through art and our tendency to extract that meaning from other people's suffering. The palace forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. Can great art be built on exploitation and still be great? Yes. The artistry is real regardless of the conditions that produced it. The Hall of Mirrors is stunning whether or not you know workers died building it. Beauty doesn't become less beautiful when you learn the price. But does knowing the price change how we should value it? Also yes. Because value isn't just aesthetic. It's moral, historical, human. A building that cost 100 million livres and an unknown number of lives means something different than a building of equal beauty built under fair conditions. Is it possible to celebrate the achievement while condemning the system? This is the central question. And the answer is, we have to. Because the alternative is either celebrating exploitation or denying that beauty matters. Both options are unacceptable. We celebrate the craftsmen who carved the stone and laid the floors and created something that has lasted 3 centuries. We condemn the system that worked them to death and paid them starvation wages while building a palace for one man's ego. We honor the artistry. We acknowledge the injustice. We hold both truths at once, however uncomfortable that is. Does preserving Versailles honor the victims or the victimizers? It depends on how the story is told. If Versailles is presented as, "Look how magnificent French kings were," it honors the victimizers. If it's presented as, "Look what French workers built and what it cost them," it honors the victims. The truth is, it should do both. Tell the full story, show the beauty, and reveal the bones beneath it. Let visitors marvel at the Hall of Mirrors and then take them to the basement kitchens. Let them see the public splendor and the hidden infrastructure. Show them exactly how the illusion worked. That's what modern Versailles increasingly tries to do. Not perfectly, not completely, but more honestly than the palace was presented for most of its history. What does Versailles teach us about power? That power loves to display itself. That spectacle can substitute for substance, at least for a while. That controlling symbols, architecture, fashion, rituals, can help control people. That when power becomes too concentrated, too disconnected from the governed, it becomes fragile rather than strong. And that, ultimately, power depends on consent. Louis XIV could make nobles dance in his court, but he couldn't make the Third Estate accept starvation indefinitely. When consent disappeared, when the people decided they'd had enough, all the gold in Versailles couldn't save the monarchy. What does it teach us about wealth? That extreme wealth concentration is inherently unstable. That systems which funnel resources upward without limit eventually collapse. That you can build a palace with a kingdom's wealth, but you can't build a sustainable society that way. That wealth disconnects. The nobles at Versailles literally couldn't see the poverty outside their windows. The structure prevented it. Servants stayed invisible. Villages were distant. The court became a bubble where spending 100,000 livres on a party seemed normal because everyone around you was doing the same. When everyone you know is wealthy, you forget that most people aren't. When your daily life involves choosing between silk coats, you lose the ability to understand what it means to choose between food and firewood. That disconnection isn't malicious. It's structural, and that makes it more dangerous, because malice can be confronted and condemned. Structural indifference just is. It feels natural to everyone inside the system. What does it teach us about class? That class systems justify themselves through mystification. The elaborate etiquette at Versailles wasn't just theater. It was ideology. It taught nobles that they were different from commoners, that they deserved special treatment because they could perform these rituals, speak this refined language, display this cultivated taste. And it taught commoners the same thing. If you couldn't navigate the etiquette, couldn't afford the clothes, couldn't speak the language, you didn't belong. Your exclusion was your fault, not the system's. Breaking that mystification required seeing through the performance, realizing that nobles were just people in expensive clothes, that etiquette was just rules, and rules could be changed, that hierarchy was maintained through habit and force, not divine mandate. The revolution broke the mystification violently, but Versailles today does it more quietly, by showing the machinery. When you see the hidden corridors and servants' quarters, when you understand that every glittering moment required dozens of invisible workers, the mystique evaporates. Nobles weren't magically refined. They had servants to handle everything unglamorous. They weren't naturally elegant. They had time and resources to cultivate elegance because they never had to work. Understanding that doesn't erase the beauty they created. But it does erase the justification for the hierarchy that made it possible. What does Versailles teach us about ourselves? Today, now. This is the uncomfortable part. We live in societies with extreme wealth inequality. Not as extreme as 18th century France. Most modern democracies don't have formal nobility. But the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest has grown dramatically in recent decades. We have our own Versailles. They're called super yachts, private jets, mega mansions, compounds where billionaires live surrounded by walls, security, and staff, as disconnected from ordinary life as any 18th century noble. We have our own invisible workers, people who clean office buildings at night, who harvest crops for wages that don't cover rent, who deliver packages and drive ride shares and work multiple jobs and still struggle. People whose labor makes modern comfort possible for others, while they themselves have no security. The specific forms change. The underlying pattern remains. Concentrated wealth at the top, exploitation at the bottom. And a middle that's anxious about which direction they're sliding. Versailles warns us that this pattern is unsustainable. That you can't indefinitely build palaces, literal or metaphorical, on other people's poverty without eventually facing a reckoning. The reckoning might not be revolution. Modern states have tools Louis XVI didn't. Surveillance, media control, welfare systems that relieve just enough pressure to prevent explosion. But it will be something. Economic crisis, social breakdown, the erosion of the legitimacy that any system needs to function. Versailles says, look at where this leads. Look at what happens when inequality becomes too extreme, when the wealthy become too disconnected, when the system serves too few at the expense of too many. And then it says, choose differently, because we can. We're not bound by divine right monarchy or feudal obligations or any of the structures that made 18th century France so rigid. We have choices. We can tax wealth progressively, can strengthen labor protections, can build systems that distribute opportunity and resources more equitably. We choose not to, often. We choose systems that concentrate wealth upward, that prioritize capital over labor, that treat inequality as a natural law rather than a political choice. But they are choices. And Versailles reminds us what happens when we choose badly for too long. The final lesson might be the simplest. Pay attention to what you're building, and to who's actually paying for it. Louis XIV thought he was building a monument to his glory and a machine to control the nobility. He didn't think he was building the symbol that would help destroy his dynasty. But that's what Versailles became. Because buildings have meanings beyond their creator's intentions. Because systems have consequences beyond their designer's vision. Because the future judges differently than the present. What we build now, our systems, our structures, our societies, will outlast us. Future generations will walk through what we've created and ask, what were they thinking? How did they justify this? Couldn't they see what they were doing? Versailles lets us practice answering those questions, lets us look at a past society's choices with clear eyes and see the beauty and the horror entangled together. And then it invites us to turn that clear sight on ourselves, on our choices, our systems, our own palaces and servants and hierarchies. The mirror shows us the past, but mirrors also show reflections. And if we're brave enough to really look, we might see ourselves. The fountains at Versailles still run. Not constantly, that would be too expensive. Would strain the water systems that even modern engineering hasn't completely solved. But on scheduled days, at scheduled times, the fountains activate. Water leaps into the air. The sculptures gleam. Visitors gather to watch. It's a performance now, not a demonstration of power. The magic is explained rather than mystified. But it's still magnificent, still worth seeing, still evidence that humans can bend nature to create beauty. In the Hall of Mirrors, light still dances. The same windows, the same mirrors, the same proportions that were calculated to overwhelm, to awe, to make visitors feel small before the king's grandeur. But there's no king now. Just tourists. Just people from every nation and class walking through a space that once excluded everyone who wasn't noble. The democratization is complete. The palace built to separate and elevate now welcomes everyone who can afford a ticket. That ticket costs $19.50 for adults, as of 2024. A modest price for accessing what once represented the absolute peak of exclusive luxury. It does. In a single day, Versailles might welcome 30,000 visitors, each paying their entry fee. In a month, the palace might generate more revenue than Louis XIV's government collected in taxes from an entire province. The economics have inverted. What once drained a kingdom now funds itself. The monument to excess has become a sustainable cultural institution. Is this redemption? Not exactly. The workers who died building Versailles aren't compensated by its modern success. The peasants who starved while nobles feasted aren't vindicated by ticket sales. The injustice is historical fact, permanent and unchangeable. But there's a kind of justice in the transformation. The palace that symbolized inequality now employs about 900 people under labor laws that protect them, pay them fairly, and acknowledge their rights as workers. The space that was built to glorify one man now serves millions. The private has become public. The exclusive has become accessible. And while that doesn't erase the past, it does mean the past no longer controls the future. Versailles will stand as long as France chooses to maintain it. And France will keep choosing to maintain it, not because of what it was, but because of what it teaches. It teaches about ambition, what humans can achieve when we coordinate effort and resources toward a singular vision. It teaches about beauty, the power of art and architecture to move us, to create spaces that transcend utility and become meaningful in themselves. It teaches about power, how it displays itself, how it controls, how it eventually fails when it becomes too disconnected from reality. It teaches about cost, that everything magnificent requires resources, labor, and often suffering. That beauty and brutality can coexist, that celebrating achievement requires acknowledging sacrifice. Most of all, it teaches about choices. Every aspect of Versailles, its location, its scale, its decoration, its purpose, resulted from choices made by people with power. Those choices had consequences. For the workers who built it, for the servants who maintained it, for the peasants who paid for it, for the kingdom that ultimately collapsed under the weight of the debts it helped create. We make similar choices now about how to distribute wealth, about whose labor we value, about what we build and preserve and celebrate, about who benefits and who pays. Versailles doesn't make those choices for us, but it does show us with absolute clarity what happens when a society chooses grandeur for a few over dignity for many, when it chooses spectacle over sustainability, when it chooses illusion over justice. The palace bankrupted a kingdom. That's historical fact, complicated but true. The money spent on Versailles could have been spent on infrastructure, on agriculture, on debt reduction, on 1,000 things that would have strengthened France instead of weakening it. But would we have those alternatives today if Louis XIV had chosen them? If he'd been prudent instead of grandiose? If he'd built schools instead of fountains? Maybe not. Maybe the buildings that are preserved precisely because they're exceptional, because they represent something beyond mere function, because they show us what's possible when resources are unlimited and ambition is unchecked. The tragedy is that resources are never actually unlimited. Someone always pays. And at Versailles, the ones who paid were the ones who could least afford it. The palace stands. The kingdom fell. The workers are forgotten. The art endures. This is what we've chosen to remember. A building, an achievement, a symbol of a moment when France reached for magnificence and grasped it, regardless of cost. And also, increasingly, we remember the cost, the deaths, the exploitation, the suffering that made the magnificence possible. Both memories matter. Both are true. Both should be taught to everyone who walks through those golden gates. Because Versailles isn't just French history, it's human history. The story of what we build, why we build it, and who actually does the building while someone else takes the credit. That story repeats in every era, in every society. The specifics change. The pattern remains. Versailles holds up a mirror. It shows us ourselves, our capacity for creation and destruction, for beauty and cruelty, for genius and blindness. What we do with that reflection is up to us. The fountains will run tomorrow. Tourists will photograph the Hall of Mirrors. The gardens will bloom in spring and quiet under snow in winter. The palace that bankrupted a kingdom will continue standing, teaching its lessons to anyone willing to learn them. And perhaps, if we listen carefully to what Versailles is trying to tell us, we'll make different choices than the ones that led to its creation. Perhaps we'll build beauty without brutality, celebrate achievement without forgetting cost, create magnificence that lifts everyone, rather than elevating a few at the expense of many. Perhaps. But first, we have to see clearly, past the gold leaf and the mirrors and the carefully maintained gardens. See the bones beneath the beauty, the system behind the spectacle, the real people who paid, the real price for this unreal perfection. Versailles offers that clarity if we're brave enough to accept it. The palace that bankrupted a kingdom has one final gift to give us: the truth. What we do with that gift is our choice. Choose wisely. If you enjoyed this deep investigation into Versailles and the price of grandeur, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which palace or mansion should we explore next: Schönbrunn, the Winter Palace, Buckingham Palace, or perhaps an American Gilded Age estate. These stories matter, not just as history, but as mirrors showing us who we are and who we choose to be.